yourself anytime in the chat, say something about yourself. Awesome. So welcome to our second Many Hearts webinar. These webinars are co-sponsored by Adler Graduate Professional School and the Alliance of Psychotherapy Training Institutions. They're an opportunity for mental health professionals to share the heart of their practice with other practitioners and the wider community. And today I'm going to pass it along to Begum Virji, Adler's provost, to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you so much, Camille. It's my pleasure, really an honor to introduce Rita Kohli. She's a dear friend and a colleague. And you know, Rita has worked for change for many, many years, for decades, in various sectors such as the anti-violence sector, health, immigrant and refugee sector, anti-race, mental health sectors, LGBTQITT2S, young offenders, and Crown wards in care, domestic and international trafficking. So her work is strongly influenced by identity politics, anti-racism, access, equity, and human rights. And she integrates a local and global analysis of power. So welcome, Rita. So glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. Okay, so is it a go for me now?
It's a go for you, Rita.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, and everybody, thank you for taking the time on a Friday evening to attend this webinar. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, okay? And the topic for today is just what it says, looking back, looking forward. Implications for a racialized equity lens for mental health practitioners. Given the current political climate, I think it's an imperative for us to have those kind of conversations. So, I'm going to read through the land acknowledgement for Toronto. Every region has a different one based on what Indigenous people or tribes are involved, or communities are involved. And so we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Even as we read this, and I ask you all to reflect on it, I want to speak on the recent spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations as a settler on Indigenous land, that I'm calling upon the Canadian federal government to address the many barriers that First Nations people experience, particularly in employment and education. I'm also, as a settler, and other settlers behind me, urging the Canadian federal government to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the murdered and missing Aboriginal women. It is also important in this historical time, and because I work from the premises that there was a time, and I still believe in it, that we used to use a saying of First Nations first. And that was not only in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Canada, and more so, and also globally, that settlers can't have their issues addressed if First Nations issues aren't addressed, or Indigenous people issues aren't addressed. I also want to call on the names of the atrocities of ongoing colonialism and the killings of Indigenous peoples. I'm particularly raising what had come to our attention of the killings of Indigenous people in Winnipeg, for example. They happen everywhere, but they happen in such quick succession. Hudson Aisha, 16 years old, Manitoba, Winnipeg. An Indigenous teenager who was shot by police following a police chase in response to a liquor store robbery. She was pronounced dead in hospital. Jason Collins, Manitoba, Winnipeg, an Indigenous man was shot and killed by a police officer following a call regarding a domestic incident just hours after the death of Aisha Hudson, also by Winnipeg police. Andrew Stewart, or Stewart Kevin Andrews, 22. Andrews died after being shot by police who were responding to a reported robbery. He was the third Indigenous person to be killed by Winnipeg in the month of April, and the fourth police shooting victim in the city. And there have been many since. And so I wanted to name them so that we can have that in our mind, that we don't have to remember people after they're dead, that we can cherish them while people are alive. And so as a settler, our work with reconciliation is more than a land acknowledgement. Sometimes I will use the word settler singularly or in a plural, depending on what I want to raise. And it is also in the discourse of that I don't speak for all settlers, but as a settler community, all of us, we do have to at some point consider a unified voice in solidarity with First Nation people. Having said that, I will proceed from here. So just to contextualize my location, as the title says, who am I? Where and how I enter the change process. If you'll see me making a hand gesture, it's just simply to Camille because I have limitations of access I'm not a host. And also I have limitations of working with computers. So to answer the question, who am I, depends on the context, how I will identify myself. And you might say, and I might say, and raising that question, why the context? Well, my location has everything to do with the context. And if the context is too dangerous for me, I will choose to erase myself and not identify in all of who I am. So having said that, it is quite obvious that I'm a South Asian older woman. And there are many contexts in which if I go in and out that I will not disclose my other identities because as I mentioned, it's too dangerous for me to express them. Do I navigate my life through those dangers and being fully cognizant of them? Yes, most of the time, and sometimes I'm brutally reminded that I'm a racialized woman. I'm particularly talking about, as mental health practitioners, is to be mindful of what is it that the client tells and what is the client who doesn't tell. And how do we pick that up and to bring them into the conversation so that we can have holistic interventions. So for the record, I identify in the material matrix or paradigm as a South Asian lesbian, feminist, a woman, older woman, or an elder as I'm called. Most people from the refugee and anti-violence sector will call me not by my name, but as Mama Rita, which I'm very honored to have been bestowed, though I resisted it. And I live with multiple disabilities at a minimum, okay? So where and how I enter the change process, insider and or outsider. So I've been engaged in change process for a very long time, and I think from the time I was born, but didn't understand that I was doing change work. I did not have the terminology, and neither did I know what I was doing, but it seemed to work. Sometimes not. Okay? So in the change process, there's clearly a discourse of who's in the center and who's at the margins. So sometimes, most of the times, I speak as the outsider. Sometimes I'll speak as the insider because I'm inside an organization and often have been in leadership position. But I'm an insider who's an outsider within the organizations based on the dominant norms of the organization and what is okay to talk about and what is not okay to talk about. And how did I, in my leadership, or when I wasn't in leadership, had a sense of agency to bring in those conversations based on my locations to do change work. So there will be no outsider without the insider. So the center versus the margins. And we may go in and out, but being at the center, such as me, I have occupied leadership positions, doesn't mean that I was necessarily at the center, or that my centeredness or being at the center was not precarious. And that I was navigating many political interests based on identities that I had to compel to become unpacked or become visible. So why the fascination and engagement with the change process has been because I am now you'll see other identities emerge. I was born in India to internally displaced refugees, a legacy of the brutal partition of India by the British. And there is much literature over there, and it is part of my research on current research on in my doctoral studies, which is to do with barriers to sexual violence disclosures by refugee women in Canada. However, it has implications broader than that in policy as well as in problems of practice. So I was born in a family of IDPs, internally displaced refugees, and I'm a survivor of intergenerational trauma. Why the fascination? Well, because I witnessed the silent pain and suffering of the women in my family, particularly my grandmother and my mother. And in terms of that, and they were my biggest mentor, particularly my grandmother. So I began a process of listening to her after much rebellion and resistance, because as any child who's growing up in a very violent context where people haven't dealt with their pain of intergenerational violence, then things happen such as children identifying with the source of power, however oppressive it might be. And I think as all mental health practitioners, we have seen that. And at the age of 16, when I had a health crisis and almost died, that is when I changed my look. And I spoke to my father in front of everybody, and I said, "You will not say that you care for us." I was 16. "And you will not raise your hand at my mother." I was 16. "And you will certainly not demean my grandmother, who was my mother and raised me." Having said that, and also I have a very significant ex-mother-in-law who has been very influential in my life to get a sense of agency, particularly of my journeys, more so in Canada, where I came 38 years ago, and I landed up on the street soon after not knowing east from west to north to south, and experienced a lot of issues to where I am today. And so I will share some of that because it frames some of the information I'll give you from my location as a Salvation woman, a bourgeois woman who could not access her bourgeois privileges most of the time. So this is a historical timeline in the evolution of frameworks integrating race and racism and implications for change. Once again, I reiterate that whereas I speak from my location here today as a South Asian woman, a diasporic South Asian woman, I also have to acknowledge and honor the many people that have shared their struggles and given me insights, who I've worked in solidarity with, such as Indigenous women, and also I'd say women because my primary sectors were and still continue to be women, even though I work with men, and I also work with children and youth, and I still do at times. So having said that, this is a simple trajectory, but it is combining the development of frameworks. In the Canadian context, these never just evolved in 1970. If you look at the dots, it's an ongoing development, okay? But I'm particularly speaking from what is within my lived context, not denying what has happened and preceded before. So in the 1970s, we had a multiculturalism framework and basically came out of Pierre Trudeau's policies on multiculturalism. But multiculturalism, as espoused in Canada, is very different from as it is espoused in the United States. And people need to be a bit mindful. We all learn from different parts of the world. We don't occur in a vacuum, but to be mindful of the contextual context where certain words may have a different meaning. So multiculturalism down south, especially APA, etc., is very different from how we contextualize multiculturalism. And it was also brought in to fill out a gap in the labor market. So multiculturalism was about song, dance, and music and costumes. I used to hate it when people used to say, are you going to wear your costume? I said, well, do you have a costume? Everybody wears clothing. How come mine is an artifact of costume? Okay, so it never went to contextualize unequal power relations, and nothing changed after the samosas, chutneys, and curries. Okay, so what happened is that we were also beginning to see in the third sector, the nonprofit sector, an emergence of racialized women and Indigenous women to some degree. And by racialized women, I mean Blacks, South Asians, Asians, those who are also biracial or multiracial, right? And so we started pushing the agenda in there from the 70s to the 80s, where we said, hello, but you know, people would just talk about gender or sex, right? And we said, well, I'm not about just, gender is one part of me, but I'm also a woman of color, okay? So skin color became a very big issue for organizing in the 1980s, even when the conservative governments were still talking about multiculturalism, and there was a resistance to it. So we dealt with a strategy to raise that there's something more over here is by talking about racism awareness. That was our strategy. So I want to contextualize, as I entered this process, I had just been denied before I even came here, first day in Canada, to go to school here because my credentials were from India. And even though I was on a roll, I was told from going back to BA first year to go back to intermediate, and currently I'm doing my doctorate. but not in the field that I wanted to be. But I just want to, I'm at a different space and I just do what I have to do because it makes me feel good now. It's not going to enhance my career or anything like that. So lots of encounters with police because we were organizing, as well as when I was just about 3-4 months here and very vulnerable. Nothing unusual for me. Actually, it was on my second day when a bus driver smacked the door shut in my face. I was wearing Indian clothes. At that time, I was new to the country. And there were empty seats in the bus. And I just stood there stunned, okay? Or I had police officers stop me and said I was jaywalking. And I said, I'm sorry, officer, no. And I spoke Queen's English at that time. My accent was very British because of my own colonial legacy in India and Bhuj legacy. But also there were other incidences, I'm just giving you one or two around this time, but also in the anti-violence sector where there would be a criminalizing of Black women. So in the shelters, very often, if a Black woman started wailing, which was not understood as a racialized cultural context. I don't talk about culture by itself because culture by itself does not happen in a vacuum. It needs to be contextualized into whose interest does it serve. And so I remember the incident one time at Women in Transition, which doesn't exist today, but that 9 undercover cops showed up at a shelter because a woman was wailing and while she was cooking. A Black woman, okay? She was upset at the racism in the criminal justice system. And she was handcuffed and taken away. I was in the community at that time. I didn't work at Women in Transition, was brought in because I was involved in the anti-racism sector, evolving anti-racism sector, to do the work in alliance with Black women as a brown woman, to be able for Black women to be heard, both as practitioners as well as clients, to change this picture. So we started with a racism awareness and started shifting in the 1990s to these kind of incidents and also the killings of various people. I was involved with the Black Women's Collective as an ally, and we were dealing with Batsy, etc., to look at killings of Black youth, Black men, and they're also bringing into the notion of this context of the racism of the police towards Black males is to introduce the notion of that lesbians, Black lesbians, and in particular Black women were also being racially harassed by the police, whether they were whisked and in searches which were sexual assaults really, and what have you. So and there had been a couple of killings of Black women at that time. So the discourse became much more powerful, as particularly in leadership from the Black Women's Collective, women of color and progressive white women joined it to be able to work along with Batsy, and where Batsy could not go around the issues of women, etc., is that we were able to together bring in changes into the police board and in how the police deal with reports or lack of reports, etc. at that time. And around that also, there was a systemic racism in the criminal justice system also that happened. So having said that, that was a very critical time when NDP government had also come into play, etc. And also a very critical issue that happened, which was, I was quite involved with it, which was the Montreal massacre, where as a brown woman, I was very much in people's faces and was along with Poonam Khosla, Prabha Khosla, Himani Banerjee, and so many other brown women, as well as Black women, saying, where were you when Black women, women of color and indigenous women were being killed? And I wrote a little bit of a spiel. I didn't know it was published. I just realized that when I went back to school, where I said, I grieve with you, but I grieve with a difference, and that I will not remain quiet about the devaluing of other women, because Montreal Massacre had 14 white women. There were some lesbians in there, but that being aside, there was no response to that. All of these led to changes in the framework, which I will show you in a moment. And so there was a notion of talking intersectionality and then the evolution of the integrated anti-racism framework. After the NDP left, there was a thrashing for all the progressive sectors. NAC, National Action Committee on the Status of Women, that had a lot of political leverage, was taken out, where the first woman of color, Sonera Tobani, and after that, a Black woman, Joan Grant Cumming, and I believe there was a Native woman after that, but I was not quite involved with it. But we don't know. I'm told there was, but I was busy doing God knows what on the ground. Also in 1992, there was a very significant conference. I happened to coordinate it from OISI, and it was called Making the Connections, Anti-Racism and Feminism, when Judy Rebick, Akwa Benjamin is Black, Judy Rebick used to be the president of NAC, said to the press that the face of feminism had changed. And I was a very yippity-yap, talk in your face person, and I said, hey, Judy, we've always been there, but you all told us we'll take care of you. And I know that because we used to have those discourses in the women's movement. Anyways, so, and then the 2000, with the conservative governments coming into play, was a backlash. So that, and also when the changes were possible in the NDP government and soon after that, there was a backlash in the progressive sectors, particularly in the women's sector, where it became anti-racism is about you and anti-oppression is about us, white women. And I will speak to that as a political critique of how we use as racialized people anti-oppression is very different from how white women, the status quo, used it, and by implications, the larger sector in Canada. So in the 2000, we moved into a framework of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the notion that we are all diverse. We moved a conversation of diverse and diversity as unequal power relations that need to be disrupted. Here it became about, oh, okay, so everybody is diverse, without contextualizing the notion of dominance and subordination based in white skin privilege, and as an entry point, race. Having said that, in the integrated anti-racism framework, the entry point was race, and it evolved in different ways, which I'll walk you through. Now we are back to multiculturalism and cultural competency without a racialized equity lens. So I am going to use the last concept of everybody is raced. So what are the implications for mental health practitioners in any population issue that you might find yourself working in, whether it's violence against women, whether it's sexually transmitted diseases, or now it's called infection, whether it is HIV/AIDS, whether it is mental health, whether it is refugee sector, everything has implications for mental health. But they may be specific to a particular issue a population is facing, but it is not experienced homogeneously. So here's the time when there was the erasure of Black women and women of color. So there's a reemergence in the current political climate where we are again rethinking how can we make change for everybody. Can you change the slide, please? Okay. So the current political climate and where to next is basically saying that we are all progressive people. We want to do good, but we cannot do good unless we are clear about our frameworks and clearly articulate whose interests do they serve. So if we look at it globally, there's lots of pandemics going on. COVID is one of them. right? There's a pandemic of trafficking, sexual trafficking. There's the pandemic of child pornography. There's the pandemic of all kinds of hunger, etc., where large populations are impacted. There's a specificity in the Canadian and North American context of the pandemic of anti-Black racism, which I will leave my Black allies to speak. And when they will give me permission to speak to it as an ally, I will speak to it, but I will reference the evolution of the framework because Black sisters were very intimately involved in bringing about these changes. Can you flip the slide, please? So I have laid the context to you. This was in late 1990s or 2000, no, it was 2011 when I first articulated this framework where race has to be at the center and comes from critical race theory, but also critical race feminist theory, okay? And also critical race LGBTQ theory, because I had my foot in all of those areas and the implications for poverty as a result, which was an everyday companion for me. Okay, so having said that, what we did was, what I articulated was I started moving the framework from just talking about race, racism, sexism, etc., as separate things. I went back to the integrated framework. So if you look at the petals, they are intersectional, and put race at the center. And this was developed and presented by me at a conference on health equity in Brussels. And so you'll see sexual trafficking. You can put any population issue around it. My focus was women, race at the center, as a way of saying that Black women, Indigenous women who were most vulnerable, women of color who were most vulnerable, Asian women who are most vulnerable. We know about all the sex tourism that happens in the third world context, is to how do we bring that discourse forward so that they are not marginalized as they have been marginalized. It was now you see it, now you don't. Did you book the interpreter for this woman, a Latina woman? No, I didn't, I forgot, was the usual response from white women. I said, how come you forget, but you remember other things for other women, meaning white women? I said, this woman cannot talk. Well, it takes too long. I said, that's really too bad. Okay, and we need to do equity, meaning doing different measures to get, I'm just giving you one example, okay? Is if the woman doesn't understand, how come she doesn't have the right to understand everything in her own language, that she can fully understand things? So if you look very briefly at the thing, the local, national, and global lens was applied. And if you see, and it's applicable to any population issues, we had 4 strategies at that time: protection, partnerships, prosecution, and prevention. I was the executive director at that time of the Rape Crisis Center of Peel, and we were the lead on sexual trafficking because Peel is a hub for both international and domestic trafficking. We had at that time in 2010 had the most convictions locally. But though square one and around it was rife with sexual trafficking, domestic, not domestic, international as well, because of the airport proximity, nobody would come forward, though the police knew, etc., etc. So what we have done is around the women and the population issue, put all the identities that are, grounds that are in the Human Rights Code, because I started moving it to a lens of legislation, and Canada is a signatory state to many international conventions, particularly violence against women and discrimination of all forms of violence against women and sexual trafficking, etc., etc. So also then looking at various systems like housing, education, etc., that women will need. Having said that, the global would include also policies and UN conventions that Canada is a signatory state, that the white women who were in real power positions weren't willing to listen and wanted to look at all issues that we were organizing in the third sector as special issues, right? Special issues went out of fashion with each government, depending on their framework. So there was no leverage to you are connected. And First Nation women learned from the organizing of white women and the limitations of it because they were involved to go to the UN and bring the accountability lens to their context, both for women as well as for men and their families into Canada. So this is how we started it, by putting race at the center to look at the marginalized experiences of racialized women, Indigenous, Black, South Asian, in all their intersectionality, to be at the center so they are not ignored. So if you had a convention on disability, your advisory committee must have First Nations women or people because they have the highest level of disability, and Black women and women of color, etc. Can you switch the channel? I do want to apologize. There were only 13 grounds written, but on the side are the grounds that are missing because I didn't have the skills to do it. And actually in 2011, there were 15 grounds, and then 2 were added after that, but I didn't know how to draw it. Okay, I still don't know how to draw it. I don't know how we got that done. These are some principles of the framework that we had created as a way of an equity lens. So center versus the margins becomes very clear. But when we put women, we didn't have a notion of the, gender is no longer a binary in law, okay, human rights, because I also do human rights work. So I also bring in those concepts into my work. The intersectionality notion has the notion of the experience of sexual violence, for example, is not experienced the same way by every Black woman or every Indigenous woman or every white woman or every South Asian woman or any woman in whatever way she was, okay? In terms of a whole personhood. So what happened was we were looking at a bottom-up change process because that historically for the last 30 years, we were seeing that racialized women, but now you see it, now you don't. And also there was a notion of solidarity versus divisiveness. So not to do divisiveness within women, but to talk across differences and also to look at impact versus intent, and that this framework is a human rights framework because it contextualizes the grounds that are embedded in every intersectional identity of the women. And I'll only leave it at that. So what happened in the 2000s when the Conservative Party came, all this was erased because A, there wasn't any money coming from NDPs to do that work. B, it was that the shifting of power relations were happening. And there was a backlash at that time, not only to the women's sector, all the progressive nonprofit sector, and that is when they took out NAC because of state funding, because we had the capacity to organize women globally, as nationally, as well as globally, and won many referendums, etc. Whose interest did it serve? The dominant status quo. It served the interests of white women who fit the dominant profile, white, blue-eyed, skinny enough, right, tall, heterosexual, able-bodied, English-speaking, okay, in terms of their ethnicities, religion, being Protestants or Catholics, okay, Catholics were at a different level, but all that profile was taken into whose interest it served. So I want you to take this away as a question. Is one thing you will commit to change, to create a culture of humility, which means is that you are going to, it's the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the other person. It requires lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique and how you benefit from it, including me, where I exercise power and privilege, to get rid of power imbalances and develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. Can you go over to the next slide, please? So later in this historical time, what I did was to just advance this framework, and I used it in a conference also, possibly at a sexual trafficking conference, and started interjecting the notion that gender was no longer binary and that women are much more vulnerable to sexual trafficking or sexual violence. Not that men don't and trans men don't, but our entry point was my sector was women. Okay, so I was coming from there, whereas we acknowledge it and also the data supports that. So in the process, what I did was started in bringing in the notion of colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. I want you to know in a very simplistic way, haves and have-nots has the notion of colonialism, okay? And that is embedded in all isms, and all isms are a way of maintaining inequality, whether you want to call it haves and have-nots in the capitalistic paradigm. The idea is to control all your resource. And I'm going to say 2 sentences. Please make a note if you want to. And that is the definition of oppression that we use, which I will come into later also, is the function of oppression is to dispossess you of your land and your body and ultimately to kill you. And if you are colonized by the oppressed mentality, you might kill yourself. The master don't have to do the work, okay? And to deconstruct colonization in its very simplistic way is that when I am living out the lies of the dominant group, that I'm not good enough, right? Is that I'm colonized. And so you have to change that, whether you do it as trauma repair, which some of you might be doing EMDR and trauma work, which I do as well, is how do we clear it also from a being which is within our brain and the nervous system. Can you please move on? Okay. So at this historic time, what I'm saying and moving an agenda of interest convergence, which comes from critical race theory, DERRICK Bell. And he stipulates, because he was in the South, that Black people will achieve the civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge, meaning white people see a benefit in it. Unless that is the case, they don't. Okay, so I've raised some questions for you all to take forward because it's too little time and it's not a workshop per se. That can Black people achieve, Black people in all their diversity, because the experiences of continental Africans and Caribbeans and those that were brought into the South, as well as the slavery in Canada, which is not spoken about in Black peoples, okay, is that can Black peoples achieve their interests of civil rights interests or their rights of equity and equality, or equality, without the attainment of the sovereignty rights of Indigenous people? And I'm coming from a perspective of each community and the uniqueness has to be held in our hands to manage it so they are not competing interests, similar to competing rights notion. All have to be accommodated under the Human Rights Code. Can it be attained without the attainment of the sovereignty rights of Indigenous people that are still promised and not achieved? Can racialized equity be achieved for all racialized people without eliminating the divide and conquer of historic and current colonialism? Okay, so can we switch that? But also I'm saying, go ahead, please. These are the grounds of the Human Rights Code. Please, 17 grounds. Gender identity and gender expression were added in the last 7 years or 8 years. I don't remember exactly, please forgive me. Can you please move on? Embedded in each of the discrimination is the ideology of systemic oppression or discrimination, which is based in an ideology of oppression, which means one group thinks that they are more superior and more deserving and more valued, should be more valued, while the subordinate is the inferior and less deserving. Now, I haven't showed it over here, maybe I've shown it. When we talked about this presentation, Begum and I had said, we're talking about program systems, but programs and systems can be put on the three corners of the triangle as well. In any sector, in any organization, governance, employment, and program systems have to be clearly articulating a racialized equity lens. If they are not, from bottom up to top down, then you will be reproducing barriers. So a very simple example is that if you don't see students who are racialized, if your demographics have changed over the last few years, like I see at OIZ, but your faculty remains predominantly white, there is a barrier in employment and teaching. If your senior administration continues to be white, there is a barrier to racialized people sitting in positions of policy control and direction. So you have to contextualize this in the notion of unequal power relations of the doer and the doee in each oppression, but the oppressions bleed into each other based on who we are, as was shown how, for example, myself, just to simplify it in the earlier two pictures, I'm a woman of color, I'm a disabled woman, I am a lesbian, I'm an older woman, and I have other things in my identity that are related to refugee, displacement, etc., etc. So if those considerations aren't there, I'm older. People tell me, you don't fit the corporate profile. It's time for you to move on. I've seen older women being asked, have you done your succession planning, right? Whereas we have something to learn from Indigenous people and also our own racialized ancestors, that the wisdom is with the elders. Give them a chance to pass the knowledge on to you. So the impact, you cannot talk about ideology and just systems and not individual behaviors. All of them feed each other. We are much more likely to talk about systems because it seems benign, because it's practices that look neutral, so to speak. I don't believe in neutrality, so that's why I say neutrality in quotes. And the end result is inequality. Okay, and so individuals who are in the dominant group walk around saying there's no problem here and then get very offended if other racialized people or any other community that is experiencing problems in all of who they are, then they get offended. And the discourse, that the silent discourse has to be said, after all I did for you, and now you're telling me that I am so-and-so, okay, comes up. And there is reprisals for that, for stepping up. Please be very clear, if anybody accesses any process of addressing a discriminatory act, they have a right to do so, and they have a right not to be reprised against. And conflicts of interest need to be very carefully managed in that kind of a context. Okay, I'm saying that because I've been in the human rights, as a human rights policy person and an investigator, and very often these issues come up, that people are well-meaning and they want to sit there. Okay, all right, so here we go. In the context of systemic racism as experienced by Indigenous, Black, South Asians, Asian people, mixed race people, they are experienced differently. The tactics of the colonial master, white supremacy, was very different. But there are three constructs that are shared in it. One is colorblind ideology. Oh, I don't see any color, okay? You're just like me, right? The belief that the way to end discrimination by treating everybody, we are just the same, okay? We're just the same, okay? And that produces, if you're going to erase me, I will start feeling that I have to leave. So all of you who are educators and all of you who are mental health practitioners, you need to ask yourself, what do I expect my students to leave behind when they enter the classroom? What do I expect my clients or my patients or whatever you call in your profession as a mental health practitioner not to speak about? What is it that I say to say silence a discourse of difference based on unequal power relations related to their social identities? The ideology of meritocracy is the belief that in a given system, success is an indicator of personal deservingness. As though personal happens in a vacuum. It doesn't. The system rewards individuals' ability and efforts that are personal achievement. No, the personhood of the person based on their identity determines who will get in and who will not. If you look at the stats, Black people, people of color, have the highest level of degrees and credentials. Somebody asked me, why are you doing your doctorate? What will it get you? I said, nada. When I needed it, I wasn't allowed to. Now I'm just giving my savings in my senior days where there's no exemption to tuition. And I don't know if I live. So who cares? I'll just go and study so that I'm busy and I don't get senile before my time. Okay, that's just how I look at it, right? So I'm pursuing it. They allowed me in this time around. 30 years later from my master's, I've gone back. I'm using myself as an example to say that I wish it would never happen to anybody, and can we all fight together to make sure that those barriers are eliminated. Deficit ideology, the belief that inequalities result not from unjust social conditions, such as systemic racism, but from intellectual, moral, cultural, and behavioral deficiencies that are assumed. Okay? So there's a complete denial of the social conditions. And a notion of less than is created, where is related to deserving and not deserving. Okay? So I've raised some questions on the side. I have about 5 minutes to try and cover the rest. Are there tensions for white people, between white people and all the intersectionality, okay? Between ideology, systemic white supremacy, racism, and people have a hard time around white supremacy. In every male supremacy, there is around violence against women. Okay, so people need to get comfortable because supremacy has a notion of a need to dominate, a need to be in a power position, and one cannot be without the other. If there's a haves, there's a have-nots, and people need to define it based on what social characteristic that is being entered, whether it's the uniqueness of one singular identity, and then to spin it as an entry point, like I said, women of color, sexual trafficking, and that all the intersectional identities are bleeding into, the race is bleeding into it. Okay, are these tensions the same for BIPOC communities, and why? I'm leaving those as conversations for people to have. Can you flip it over, please? Go ahead. Okay, so I'm not going to speak to it, but I've already said these things in my presentation, right? That social construction of race and racism. These are things that are created. They are not biological factors. There are people who have decided, and it's been the constant basis for absolutely horrific colonization. And I don't talk about neocolonialism. I'd say the ideology is the same, the manifestation changes, okay? And you will see there's a possibility of a resurgence from the South coming up, given what is happening down South. Different groups are racialized differently based on responses to the labor market and allowed in. But there is a divide and conquer that happens between Indigenous, Black, South Asians, and Asians based on that. Intersectionality I have spoken to, but what I want you to know is that intersectionality, when we are talking about race only, which is where I'm going in the framework, it includes white people. When we started the discourse, it was about racialized people only because that was the piece. that we wanted to bring forward. Now we are talking about everybody is raced. So race in the center that I showed you the pictures will mean also white people, because they couldn't understand that if we did it as an equity approach of putting indigenous and black people in the middle and racialized people in the middle, BIPOC people's bodies, that it would take care of them, because that's the worst case scenario that we are organizing from. So intersectionality makes the experiences of discrimination or barriers, which is a soft, polite way, different. You cannot have a cookie cutter approach to dealing with mental health in any area, population issues, without contextualizing all of who the person is. Based on the identities and the population issue that is being faced. So no cookie cutter approach. Come here, can you move it? I'm almost done. Carol Aylward is a Canadian lawyer, as far as I know, and she has spoken, in addition to the themes of critical race theory and critical feminist theory, it's a critical race theory in the Canadian context, race at the center, and I've showed you how. Now race will be everybody, but it will still have the bodies of Black people in there, okay? Not as an add-on. That's what happened to us in everything. We'll take care of you afterwards, and it never happened. I've spoken about color blindness, but I want to speak about contextual analysis. This is where all of who the person is very important. Okay, contextual means is that it's a lived context where the person is experiencing barriers based in their intersectional identities and has a consideration of the historical, social, and political context that recognizes the unique experiences of the individuals based on the intersection of all relevant grounds. And also that based on the confluence of grounds, this approach allows the particular experience of discrimination to be acknowledged and remedied. So a South Asian woman who's straight, doesn't have disabilities, is young, will have very different experience of racism in all of who she is than me, okay? I cannot have, I was just speaking to a psychotherapist because of my own motor vehicle accidents and my 8th rear end that I've experienced. People like to hit me from the back for some reason. And I cannot engage with people if people will regard me as something of, that I have no history. Okay, and it's not only me, it's a history of South Asians. So I sent you 2 articles, please read them very clearly. The experiences of different communities that have been historically marginalized. Okay, can we go to the next one? I had developed this framework to wrap up. Mental health framework, I wrote it, but I developed it from a perspective of clinical supervision. I'm a clinical supervisor also and a consultant. Is how do we get to understand what happens in the 3rd space, which you see in the middle, 3rd space. Clients come to us because of certain population issues that they experience based in their social identity as well as their positional identity. They're a client, okay? Then you have the mental health practitioner whose social identities and positional identities simultaneously impact on the experiences in the 3rd space of the client in therapy or whatever way you call your practice, social work or whatever. And the systems that are impacting, because the client doesn't happen and the reality doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every institution, if you see the pictures that I had shown, education, health, immigration, everything has to have a consideration. Undocumented women, undocumented men have a very different kind of experience. Those who can't even fundamentally afford food, let alone healthcare. Okay, so the social, political, local, economic, imperialism, colonialism, that is contextualized along with capitalism, has to be considered where you look at it from a holistic framework. Holistic means that you're not fragmenting somebody. Fragmentation means it's not safe. So you leave parts of you behind and you say, thank God I can go and talk to somebody and get a few things. Okay? But if you don't allow them to be fully present, they will be in and out, a revolving door for them. I want to emphasize culture, local and the global. Culture does not happen in a vacuum. Culture serves. White people have culture. White people have ethnicity. White people have accent. White people have race. So in this kind of a conversation, everybody will be taken care of, where in the third space, race becomes centric. It's an entry point, a lens, to be able to see everybody in the picture. If you looked at those circles, I will say, now everybody is race, so you might as well look at who's sitting in front of me. Oh, it's a white older woman. Okay, let me see if she's a lesbian or it's a straight woman. Okay, so I'll get the demographics. I'll say, okay, so you have a cardiac condition? Okay, so let me see what I can do for you. You don't have status? How come? I became undocumented because of whatever. Okay, or I became homeless because of whatever, because of the abuse that I was experiencing. I have to look at every aspect and ask her at the end, is there something that you haven't told me? And reassure her that there will be no judgments and her information is confidential, and explain her the limits of confidentiality when I will breach it. So, and all the ethics that are involved with the practice. So please, this sticking to we all have cultures is not going to work. It's a notion of multiculturalism that has not worked historically. We still have to have an anti-racist lens and locate people, whether they're on the dominant side or the subordinate side. Can you just turn it forward? I'm almost done. This is realigning a racialized intersectional equity framework for mental health practice. I'm asking these questions. Where are you at in your framework? And I've shown you some of the progressive moments or different kinds of practices, okay? And I haven't put in anti-colonial lens over it, but it is very much embedded in it, because racism cannot happen without a consideration of colonialism and identity politics. So anti-racism, anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-oppression, anti-racism, all this tells you a power struggle to defeat a racialized equity lens, okay? Anti-oppression, to equity, diversity, and inclusion, to multiculturalism, and anti-racism. We don't know. I didn't put any arrows because I don't know where it will go. Okay, identity, where we are, I'm looking at is I'm going to move the intersectionality of identities from a human rights lens and look at race. Everybody is raced. Everybody's interest has to be taken care of from the front end without denying that white people are raised from a dominance perspective and have power and privilege related to it, and that fragility, white fragility, is something that should be taken care of in a caucus methodology, caucus and group methodology, where they should sit in a group and sort it out about their guilt, which I describe as guilt, not from today. Guilt is a useless emotion. It makes you feel good about feeling bad, so you don't have to change. I also exercise power and privilege in certain ways, which are socially conferred. It's my class privilege, though sometimes I can't access it because I'm a brown older woman with disabilities, okay? So having said that, locate where you are at in your framework, identify where is your workplace or institution at in its framework, where is the global community at? Do we have the capacity to influence and share solidarity globally? And at this historical moment, we have certainly seen the rise of the global community reaching out in solidarity with current events which have to do with anti-Black racism, which I will not speak to beyond that till I'm invited to speak as to how can I, as an ally, which I have done in the past, to assist the change processes that they need In the meantime, I do what I do in my own subversive way, behind the scenes. To whoever wants to recourse me, I will assist them in the best way I can. And the last question, where will the change emerge from? I will speak to that in one sentence. The change occurs from the body of a First Nation woman or a trans person in all of who she or they are. Okay? Or a Black woman in all of who she or they are, as they are trans. So because the frameworks of change are divided by state politics, that we fall under a different set of rules in some ways, though the Constitution recognizes First Nation people, but there are old treaty agreements that were used to completely exploit First Nations people. I cannot do my work without locating myself as a South Asian woman in all of who I am, in solidarity with First Nations, Black, Asian, mixed race, South Asian, diasporic and otherwise, in all of who they are. If anybody is offended by what I have said, I invite you to have a conversation with me, as my number is available. And I look forward to having some question and answers, because I think this is the last slide. Camille? Is that the last slide? Yeah.
Yep,
so
that's right. That's the last one.
Okay, so can you just put it up so people can, if they want to see my email address, etc., they have it. Okay, I didn't do badly.
You did well. You did well. It's now open to questions and comments. And Camille, there was a question in the chat, which is, can the recording be viewed again? And if so, how?
Yes, so we're recording this session and we'll be posting this on Adler's YouTube channel. And I will send a link to the recording to everyone who registered or attended the webinar. So you'll all have access to this recording of the webinar. And let me know if that answered the question.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the attendees, from the participants?
Can we take on the presentation? How come nobody wants to ask any questions?
So you're able to raise your hand. There should be a button at the very bottom. Or maybe it doesn't have it on this one. There's also a question and answer box. So you'll see Q&A on the bottom, and you're welcome to put some questions in there if you have anything to ask Rita.
Otherwise, I'll tell you a story in the meantime. I'm allowed as an older woman. Okay, there's a question there.
There's a comment. Anahita says, thanks so much. It's an amazing presentation.
Thank you very much. I am very blessed to have worked with some amazing women and to move the ideology that all forms of isms are social determinants of health, and to how important health equity framework is. And every population issue has to be looked at from the notion of health. At one point when I was running agencies, we were looking at or anticipating at some point the Ministry of Community and Social Services would go and everything will fall under the rubric of the Ministry of Health, as it happened in the United Kingdom at one point. And also I'm very respectful of some of the movements that happened in England, where there were moments where people came together. And so if Black people were being attacked, South Asian women, South Asian people, Asian people all sat back and weren't willing to be bought and step out of the line. So that is the kind of solidarity we need to say. We will not be diminished. So if First Nation people are the focus, we stand in solidarity with them. Sometimes we'll not be able to be there. Okay, I no longer can walk in marches. So what I do is I help people behind the scenes. So if they want to conceptualize something, because I'm an organizational capacity building person, I'll say, come have a conversation with me, okay? And I'll help you to put out what you want and conceptualize it in a way that you can move it forward. And also one thing that we weren't allowed to do in our time was look after our health. There was no permission. Either you were by my side or you weren't, okay? It was a strange kind of a conversation, but there was so much scarcity and a need to, oh, we have the right moment, let's make use of it. So somebody like me who came through those processes, I have several chronic illnesses. So I do work with certain people on the front lines at the moment and will say, you need to share the leadership. You need to teach each other. And you need to step back and rest. There will be moments where you will be needed when somebody else can't stand up. So make sure everybody is healthy, okay? I hope that answered the question, or I rambled.
Rita, there's another question here. Intergenerational trauma. Can you talk about it?
What do you want to know? Can somebody write something else in it? I will explain it. Is there something specific in there? Okay.
In the chat, there isn't anything specific.
Okay. Right. So if we look at the impact of colonialism, if we want to learn from indigenous way of healing, or other people have their own kind of understanding, where we are bringing in the notion of from generation to generation to generation, there was not only violence from the colonizer, but we reproduced the violence. And so the intergenerational violence, which is the legacy of colonialism, continued, right? And if you look at First Nation people, they're saying that this is the generation that will, and it's a good principle, good knowledge, a very spiritual way to look at that this generation will break the cycle of intergenerational trauma and heal the wounds of their ancestors 7 years back and prepare for future generations 7 years forward. So it is also a belief system, like I mentioned that I'm an intergenerational survivor because we have been conquered so many times. And there are certain things, because I also come from an honor-based culture, and this has been, and I used to watch women particularly, where whenever something came up, and even a tradition, I'll just share something with you, is Karwa Chauth, is a ceremony on a particular moon where women celebrate, it's a full moon, I think it is kind of fallish when it happens, and there's such pathos that there's an intensity, which is the wounding of generations of women who are singing and hoping that they will die before their husbands, right? Because the status of women is so secondary in the Indian context, and it's a very romanticized ritual. Or I sometimes say as a South Asian, why do I have to tie a rakhi or a string around my brother's hand, and that means he will protect me? When I left my husband, I was married once, and I left him within 2 days. I gave him a notice that I would leave within 6 months. And I left earlier than that. But I went through a pretty horrific process of coming home to myself. There was a lot of sexual exploitation, etc. But I carry the trauma of my grandmothers and their mothers and their brothers and their sisters. The men in our family were very damaged because of the colonial process. So in different ways, but women bore the brunt of it, and the children. One of my brothers was clinically depressed from childhood, and the eldest one at the brunt of my father's wrath, his untold story and pain, and he died of a stroke, I believe, and my second brother was murdered. And my third brother remains, and he is a very vulnerable, very caring boy, but very easily to cry. And also suffers from depression. There was a lot of alcohol and addiction, which is a manifestation of intergenerational trauma. And the women have their own issues of sexual violence. I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor of incest, extrafamilial sexual violence as a child, and also as an adult, survivor of multiple sexual assaults. I do this work because I want to give whatever I can to change this so that women and children will be spared of the violence that we are doing, not only to them and by implications to nature. They are not mutually exclusive. So globally, that's what I intend to do till the day that I even tell mental health practitioners, hopefully I'll see you one of these days, and if I have dementia, and I said, I know you did that good. So intergenerational trauma is just that, generation to generation, where trauma is hidden, not spoken of, shame-based, and it reproduces itself and results in all kinds of mental health issues other than PTSD. So both physical as well as emotional and psychological injuries, physical injuries are not mutually exclusive from emotional, physical, and spiritual stunting. So I have spoken to you today as an intergenerational violence survivor in a material matrix. The goal is, how do I survive? Because our pain is attachment to pain and suffering. Now I'm speaking to you in karmic terms. Our attachment is to pain and suffering. How do I detach myself and become an observer and the observed, so that I can be present mindfully in the present, in all my personal power, which is spiritual power and is not related to any identities. That is how I have increasingly been able to manage my life. They're not separate. And we can learn, again, I will say, from indigenous people throughout the world. And also to be mindful of the appropriation and erasure that is constant. Mindfulness and meditation comes from the third world. It's changed. That's fine. But people need to really understand what the roots were and why it was created. Right? People just flippantly say it comes from the East, but will reference only North American psychologists, etc., as to who went to India and then did this, and now you only talk about them because the credibility is tied to credentials. Credentials are about commodifying knowledge and who can speak for it, etc. So I've said several notions in the process because that's how my mind runs when I am at the end of the day. Did I answer your question?
There's no response, but you must have. Another question, for a therapist, would you say that deeply understanding cultural references are necessary to offer therapy to service specific populations?
Whose culture are we talking about? And can culture be understood without a notion of globalized racism? Okay, so the doer and the doing. Even me, if I was sitting in front of a South Asian woman, let's say I was talking to you, Begum, in a therapeutic context, I can't look at you without the notion of what globalized colonialism has done to you and how it has impacted you. I will say that my other aspects of my life make my experiences very different, and so does it yours. So I have to do a contextual analysis. What is your lived context? Where did you come from? Why did you come here? What is your experience here? Who are you? How do you identify yourself? What is parts of you that you don't talk about? What is that about? All of them create a culture within you of your lived experience. So I cannot look at culture in a vacuous way. All the isms. Is the South Asian culture devoid of notions of heterosexuality? Well, they didn't even recognize LGBT, well, they recognize trans before they recognize lesbians and gays and bisexuals, okay? And so it was, so you have to really contextualize it in people's reality. Are you blue-collared? Are you white-collared? Because it will have implications in all of who you are. Also, what your experiences were in context of what you observed in your family of origin and the stories that you know. Because in our storytelling is the intergenerational trauma messaging. Okay, so the pathos of the women, I'll never forget. I said, so how come my dad doesn't fast and mom has to fast? And then she's crying and praying that she died before her dad. It had to do with widows to date in India and globally, much more in the Eastern context, are much more likely to be violated in every way possible. They have no rights in a significant way, even though they are endowed in constitutions, but in practice, that's not the case. So what I'm saying is, my answer is, you need to decipher from what eye are you looking at the information that is being provided to you. Okay? So that means you need to know your lens, how and where you enter the process, where and how the client enters the process, and how does the world reside in that process as you interact with each other, because that will create the culture of equality or inequality. That's my answer.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
No other questions at the moment. I can see how easy it would be to talk to you, Rita. And that, you know, I know that you would have my interest at heart and that you would ask questions that might be difficult for me, but really asking questions to get to know me, my historical context, my lived reality.
Well, Begum, when I was a really radical feminist, a woman of color, we would say historical. We have to have a sense of humor. So I just want to contextualize one thing before we end, if there won't be any questions, is that I want to contextualize racism in the way that human rights law defines it. Okay? It is about, and it's in your documents, but skin color, your nationality, your place of birth, ethnicity, all of those things come into play. Okay? Language is subsumed under ethnicity. Okay? They are not mutually exclusive. Nowadays, if complaints come forward, when I was at Humber doing investigations, etc., it wasn't a single issue, single ground. Multiple grounds people will come up with complaints. Okay? And racism was one of the highest. Whether they're substantiated or not, that's a different story. Disability was another. And then sexual orientation. Also gender was way up on the top end. But it would come as an entry as race and other intersectionalities, or gender and other intersectionalities, depending on who, if it was a white person, how they approached it, etc. So the question is there such a thing as reverse racism towards white people? And my answer is no, because in one of the slides I say prejudice plus power. I don't have socially conferred power and privilege that white people have, because I have to have power to activate my prejudices and stereotypes to discriminate against anyone. No matter I'm a woman of color, I can discriminate on somebody using my bourgeois sensibilities and sophistication to make somebody miserable. Okay, meaning devalue them, dehumanize them if I wanted to do it. Have I done that? Nobody is an exception. We didn't know. Okay, our role models are one up, one down relationships. So the cultural humility is anybody can discriminate. To accept that and to take responsibility. Be mindful. Think before you say anything. Even if it is true, do you need to? This was saying that Sister Ruby, Mayan Black Indigenous woman that I had the pleasure, it's Nancy Sin's mother, that I had the pleasure of knowing and who was one of my mentors, is that she would say, even if it is true, is it important to say it if it's going to hurt somebody? Right? So in her own way, she was saying, are you acting out something to get back at somebody? Right? Do you need to say it? I said, okay, whatever. She said, not whatever, okay? I want you to think about it. But she used to talk to us all, young women, when we formed a center in her name, because Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, which includes South Asian and Asian women, who would be treated badly in white dominant run ideologies, okay? And so what would happen is that we decided, we were talking amongst ourselves that we're tired, we leave workplaces. I used to talk, I knew my exit date before I entered an agency, because I knew I would do change work inside. And at some point, you're on the hot seat. And I used to say, okay, I'm on the hot seat in my collective meetings where there was an assumption of equality and we are moving a discourse of difference. Right? So I would say, okay, go for it. And I would do the rebuttals. Was it painful? Yes. So there's a legacy of being sister outsider, Audre Lorde's words. Okay? So having said that, that's in the material matrix, but at this point where the material matrix is so corrupt, and we are in a state of 1% spiritual purity, if you do meditation, mindfulness, you'll be told those things, particularly if you practice Raj Yoga. I practice 4 different yoga meditations and learnings. Then what happens is that you need to, there is the capacity of hopefulness in the notion of disruption of intergenerational violence, 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And I will say to you, my practice is predominantly, I do 3 things. I do clinical supervision, I do training and development, and I do, as you know, psychotherapy. 95% of my practice is racialized communities, including Indigenous and Black millennials. Okay, it's BIPOC communities. Okay, I do see older people also, but I also do couple work, etc. Okay, and sometimes I'll do community and family mediation, not anymore because I'm in school. Okay, and I'm behind. Okay. And I intend to finish my EDD. PhD is for the elites, and it's usually a very white dominant profile of psychologists. If at all, you will see Iranians and some South Asians sometimes. I rarely ever see few Black people, very few Indigenous, not from here anyways, at OIC, the Ivory Tower. I haven't, and I could be wrong. Okay, I've gone back, the demographics are different of students, but the experiences, because the program and curriculum is white Eurocentric. It's a problem. So people need to really deconstruct all governance program systems, which is the students' experiences, employees. They are not, if you have a student complaining about something, an employee or a teacher by that, or a mental health practitioner by that identity, is also facing those kind of discriminatory practices, whether they're at governance level or management level. We don't have to compete with each other, is what I'm saying. I don't want to have a discourse of what is, my pain is worse than yours. I want to, and I did do mediations in organizations where if I'm racist, then you're anti-Semitic. Or if I'm racist, then you are lesbophobic. So I said, okay, if you're going to bring in issues other than what is on the table, I'm going to park it, but I will deal with it. But I'm not going to derail the protagonist who's brought up an issue of racism. Tell me so-and-so, did you hire me because I'm a Black woman and I'm a poor Black woman and I was a client in the agency? Because that was the gossip and rumor mongering, right? Is that why you let me do certain things? Like drive me home sometimes? Is that the benevolence of the white person who was in leadership? I don't need your ride. I thought you were a sister, right? And everybody who was in the white group, all of a sudden we are unsafe. So I had to process that. That was the diversionary tactics. Tell me what is it that the woman said and how she said it. And it's the how you need to focus on, okay? Not even so much as what you said, though that's important, okay? It's the how it is said, where the impact will come out, and psychological harassment, etc. So I said, this is what she said. Tell me which part of it was abusive to you and you felt that it created an unsafe environment. So no answer. So I said, I will give you some queries. Is she a board member that she can fire you as the ED? No. Did she, other than speak with a lot of feeling and intensity, which is what happens with women who have multi-layered aspects of their racialized identity, will speak with a lot of intensity, but as workers, we can't handle it and make it about them. I said, what was it? She just said she was passionate before, now she's tyrannizing you, right? Because she passionately, same passionate one, right? And so at the end of the day, it became, will she pick up a chair and hit you? Did she say anything to threaten you that way? I had to go through emotional, psychological, sexual, spiritual abuse in every form, giving examples, right? And so at the end of the day, no, no, no. I said, so it is about diverting the issue of accountability and responsibility. So the people at the bottom just get worn down and leave parts of themselves behind because they have to put food on the table and get sick while they're looking for a job. Or at the end of the day, they cannot perform and they get fired. So then I dealt with the other issues. You said this was lesbophobic or anti-Semitic or ableist. Tell me which part was it that was said. I can't let you bring in anything else. What is it? And what was said was XYZ. No answer. Then again, I would give examples to deconstruct. Then I put them with a white co-facilitator and say, go and clean it up. In terms of the dominance and the, how dare a Black woman say this? I'm just giving you one example of many mediations I have done. So from small groups to large groups to families, etc. So it's the fluidity, and we need to, and have I had occasion where racism and classism was operating, where the white woman was working class, let's say? Yes. And we dealt with both, but dealt first with the person who raised it. And then said, okay, I'm inviting you now to say, I had different models that I had developed. Okay, so are we done now? I think it's
Thank you, Rita.
7:37 and there's
Yeah.
no more questions.
No
and
more
I have a
questions.
client at 8. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And Rita, I want to thank you for sharing, your historical context of your life and work, particularly in your talk about the evolution of a racialized intersectional equity framework for mental health. And what I'm taking away personally is what you said about know your lens, know your lens, know, within which framework you're working, to really connect with your clients.
Yes. So I have one last comment, okay? I want to say this, in this critical moment, is there a way that we can come within our differences to not reproduce the historic racist hegemonic politics? And I contextualize it in women's work, you can insert people in it, okay? Historically, it was Black women were feared, Asian women, South Asian women despised, Asian women don't exist. And First Nation women, now you see them, now you don't. If at all you see them doing the tom-toms, the drumming, and the healing circle, and nothing changes. So there is a push towards systemic is more important than individual. I don't think that you can work the transformation triangle without dealing with all 3 corners.
Yes. Good.
Okay, because that's how it's sustained.
Thank you very much.
So having said that, are you going to stand? Because if one of us is experiencing some kind of barrier, it can happen to you too.
Yeah.
So on that note, don't be a sister outsider or a brother outsider. For the brothers in the agency, Idowu, I saw your name. Okay, my child, I remember you very clearly from the BREM program. Take care of yourself, and I hope you're well. Everybody, be safe and be well. It was an honor and a privilege to be here with you all. Have a good night and a safe one.
Thank you so much, Rita. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. I will say Om Shanti. That means I am a soul greeting another soul in peace. Peace.
Thank you for the reminder.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay.
Shall I leave now? Do I have permission?
Camille.
Absolutely. I'll just let the participants know you'll be receiving a follow-up email that will have a recording of this session, a feedback form, and a link to request the psychotherapy certificate of attendance. So keep an eye out for that email. We hope to see you again. Thank you so much, Rita and Begum, for joining us tonight and sharing your wisdom with us. It was incredibly important and relevant now and always. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening.
Thanks, you too. And thanks, Camille, for helping us put this together. And again, thank you, Rita, with much gratitude. Thank you.